focusing on how we can make efficient and trustworthy guidelines. So that's what I'm going to be talking about over the next few hours. As Phyllis said, this is by no means an exhaustive workshop. In fact, I could probably speak about guidelines and systematic reviews and evidence implementation for probably 2 weeks straight. So today is just a snippet or a snapshot of how we can create trustworthy guidelines. But I hope that I will be able to point you in the right direction for further resources and further learning as well. So that is what we will be focusing on today. Now, of course, and I'm sure you're all aware, it's always important to make sure that as part of guideline development, we have a conflict of interest policy, and that it's very clear if anyone on the panel or involved in the guideline has any conflicts or anything to disclose. So by means of introduction and also my conflicts or disclosures, they're all on this slide just here. As you can see, they are largely academic or intellectual in nature. I am the Director of History at the School of Public Health at the University of Adelaide. I'm a member of the GRADE Working Group and a GRADE Centre Director, so I'm very, very much heavily invested in GRADE methods. I am the past chair of the Guidelines International Network, and I'm still a trustee of the board for the Guidelines International Network. Now, myself and my group, we do receive funding for systematic reviews and guidelines, but this is not from pharmaceutical or medical device companies, not from industry, but we work with groups like the World Health Organization and some professional societies and charities. I'm also the head of the Evidence Synthesis Taxonomy Initiative, which is about harmonizing and improving methods for evidence synthesis, and I'm involved in many methodology groups. Now, as I mentioned, we won't have time to cover it all today, but please do feel free to reach out and connect with me on Twitter, or X, as I should say nowadays. And also my email address is just here, and I'm very welcoming to any emails from any of you. So please feel free to send me an email if you have any questions about the workshop today, and I'll do my best to give some advice as well. And I receive a lot of funding from the National Health and Medical Research Council through an investigator grant in Australia. Okay, so that's a little bit about me. So what are we going to cover in the next 3 hours? I'll start off with a bit of an overview on guidelines and trustworthy guidelines, and how we can tell the difference between guidelines that we can trust and perhaps guidelines that we shouldn't trust. We'll also talk about methods to adopt or adapt guidelines so that we can build on the work of others as well to make the process more efficient. We'll also discuss the criteria that should be considered when making a recommendation. So obviously not just focusing on the benefits of a particular treatment strategy or intervention, but all of the criteria that we should consider when making a recommendation or a decision. I'll touch on implementation as well, and also touch on how we can form guideline panels, appropriate guideline panels to make recommendations and to manage these panels as well. What I want you to do as a table is to give me your big, burning, key question in guidelines, or key challenge, or key problem. And once I collect all of these, I'll try to make sure that I touch on these throughout the presentation today. So you're going to have to go through a bit of a quick prioritisation process, all of you, as we do in guideline development, as you try to rank the most important challenge or question that you'd like addressed today. Wonderful. Well, they are some really important questions, and these are actually really common questions around the globe when we ask about the key challenges and issues in guidelines. So fantastic. Thank you all for sharing these. As we go through the slides today, I think a lot of these we will touch on, but as I mentioned, we will come back to this slide at the end of the day to make sure that I've given you some sort of answer, or at least pointed you in the direction of some sort of resource to help with this. So very good. That was a great exercise, great way to start us off. Okay, so I'm going to now move into what are trustworthy guidelines. And I know a lot of you have been involved in guideline development, but I think it's good to just set the scene, make sure we're all talking about the same thing here. So when we talk about guidelines, we often use this definition, which is from the Institute of Medicine. from their seminal book, Clinical Practice Guidelines We Can Trust. And this was a really important definition at the time, because they were stressing that guidelines need to be based on a systematic review of evidence, and they also need to consider the benefits and harms of alternative care options. Now, nowadays, this seems like common sense, but actually, when this definition was first proposed, there was still a lot of guidelines which were using just expert opinion in their development. And we used to call this the GOBSTAT approach, the traditional approach to developing guidelines, which stood for good old boys sitting around the table making recommendations. And it wasn't really evidence-based medicine, it was eminence-based medicine. The powerful figures, the leaders in the field making all the recommendations. So this was a really important definition at the time to say that guidelines should be based on systematic reviews, and they should also consider benefits and harms. Because historically there was a lot of focus on just the benefits of an intervention or treatment strategy and not considering the actual harms as well. So really important. I think a more modern definition now for guidelines is this one, which just came out recently in the WHO Handbook for Guideline Contextualisation, where they talk about trustworthy guidelines giving evidence-informed advice in response to priorities. So actually developing advice which is in response to identified priorities. They also address these questions using the best available evidence. So once again, broadening this concept of a systematic review, which some people perceive to be just a systematic review of randomised controlled trials, but actually broadening this to the best available evidence, whatever that evidence may be, not just randomised controlled trials. Acknowledging, of course, randomised controlled trials are still likely to provide us the highest certainty. But then they also brought back this judgments of experts, which was kind of taken out of that original definition. And of course, experts are incredibly important in the guideline development process. And in guideline development, there are a lot of value-based judgments. The experts or the panel are making judgments based on the evidence and how it applies in their jurisdiction or for the populations that they're making recommendations for. So it's important to bring this back in, but making sure that this is transparent. When we are using expert judgments on the evidence or other evidence, other recommendation criteria, it needs to be transparent. And also this definition stresses the need to include stakeholders in the process as well. And all the different types of stakeholders, from your clinicians, to your policymakers, to your administrators, to patients and the public, and those with lived experience as well. So I think this is a really nice definition of guidelines. So, according to these definitions, what are guidelines? Well, here's a couple of examples of what guidelines are. For example, here's some guidelines that we've been involved with. These are the WHO guidelines for malaria, and the smoking cessation guidelines in Australia from the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. And within the WHO guidelines, you can see here there are these formal recommendations, these actionable statements, which recommend a treatment or an intervention and which is formally graded, and the certainty of assessment is certainty of evidence is assessed. And same goes in the smoking cessation guidelines here. Formal recommendations developed by a panel considering the evidence and through the judgments of experts and stakeholders. There is a little bit of confusion about what guidelines are, and a lot of people use guidelines as a very, very broad term. And sometimes you realise you're talking about guidelines to someone and you're both thinking about different things. So when I'm talking about guidelines today, I'm talking about these formal documents here, with formal actionable statements at the end, these recommendations. Not necessarily talking about protocols, pathways, manuals, care bundles, textbooks, standard operating procedures, treatment ladders, these sorts of things that sometimes people refer to as guidelines. Now, I'm not saying these aren't useful. These are very, very useful, and ideally, these would actually be based on guideline recommendations. These are really useful products to help support the implementation of a guideline. But sometimes when people talk about guidelines or guidance, they're talking about these things, and sometimes, or more often than not, really, they're not necessarily built on guidelines. So very useful tools and products, but not guidelines themselves. Okay, so that's what guidelines are, but how do we ensure that guidelines are trustworthy? Well, this is really important because you know that non-trustworthy guidelines, they propagate the interests of conflicted parties and don't have adequate conflict of interest management procedures. They can contribute to research waste or waste of resources because we know that guideline development is quite costly and time consuming, and if the end recommendations are not trustworthy, this is really just a waste of scarce resources, and they may adversely impact outcomes and efficiencies. Whereas trustworthy guidelines we know can actually improve outcomes, increase efficiencies, reduce low-value care, and because they are transparent and rigorous in their methodology, can actually be more easily adopted or adapted to other jurisdictions or contexts. So they actually reduce research waste or reduce the actual costs of developing guidelines because others are able to more easily adopt or adapt them or build upon them for their guidelines and their context. So how do we create trustworthy guidelines? Well, there are lots of groups around the globe who obviously are working on developing and advancing guideline methods. And the resources that at least I use grade methods to develop my guidelines. We can also follow the WHO handbook for guideline development, the Agreed To tool for assessing the trustworthiness or quality of our guidelines. We can also join the Guidelines International Network and actually meet and share experiences with other guideline developers from across the globe. And in Australia, we have the NHMRC Guidelines for Guidelines handbook. And if you're developing guidelines in Australia, this is what we need to follow if we want our guidelines to be endorsed. And as Phyllis mentioned, there will soon be somewhat of an equivalent here in Singapore when ACE develop the Guidelines for Guidelines as well. Very good. There are also these different groups have these standards for trustworthy guidelines. So you can see from WHO, from Institute of Medicine, from GIN as well, and the NHMRC. So there are these different standards. But what I would like you all now to just discuss once again, do you think your guidelines are trustworthy? Or how do you, as your actual guideline group, create trustworthy guidelines? And what might you need to work on? I'm just going to touch on this issue of guidelines expiring. I'm just going to touch on it now so we don't lose it because I don't actually have any slides or sections on this, but it's come up a couple of times now about guidelines going out of date. I'll also mention it in my plenary presentation tomorrow. But this is a big issue, it's a big challenge. Guideline development takes a lot of time and a lot of resources. And so when we actually release the guidelines, we want them to reflect the current evidence and be useful in practice. But we know that historically a lot of guidelines are almost out of date, if not out of date by the time they're actually published, because the search may have been 12 or 18 months ago even. So there's a few different ways to respond to this. One of them is what's called living evidence or living guidelines. And perhaps some of you may have heard about this movement towards living evidence and living guidelines. Essentially, with living evidence and living guidelines, what we do is we still create a guideline basically in the same processes, right? And sometimes we refer to this as climbing the mountain. We still need to invest a lot of resources to create this baseline version of our guideline. But then instead of just saying, great, we've done our guideline, we should all pat each other on the back and it will get implemented in practice, and then we'll come back in 3 or 5 or 10 years to update it. What actually happens is the panel, it's a living panel. They stay together, and the technical team actually perform searches every month, every 3 months, depending on the nature of the topic, and actually try to identify if any new evidence is coming up which would impact the recommendation. And this is the important thing, which would actually impact the recommendation, because not all new studies are actually going to perhaps change the certainty or the strength of a recommendation, but there may be some triggers for an update. So what happens is you climb this mountain, developing the guideline, but then you stay on the plateau, you stay at the top, and you invest minimal resources to keep it up to date, and then it's always reflective of current evidence. Now, the jury is still out whether or not this actually saves time and resources over the long run. But we know that obviously there's always going to be this big investment in cost to develop that baseline version. But then rather than having a big investment in costs every 3 to 5 or 10 years when we do the guideline, we can spread those costs over the number of years to keep it living and up to date. So that's one approach to how we do living evidence. Now, not all recommendations within a guideline will also need to be living. So there's processes to actually prioritise what PICOs or systematic reviews do we need to keep living. Because some fields, some topics will be very fast moving. There'll be lots and lots of new evidence, new trials coming out, which could impact our recommendation. Others, not so much. Others are more consistent. You may actually have high certainty evidence already, and we know actually from the meta research that recommendations and evidence situations where there is high certainty evidence, they're less likely to change over time in light of new evidence. So you don't actually need to necessarily keep all of your recommendations or systematic reviews if you're doing them living. Just the ones that are more likely to actually need to be to have new evidence emerging. So it's a big shift. It's a big shift to go to this model, and there's a lot of challenges with it. So people are trying to tackle this. I think this is going to be the future, but it's actually a big challenge. So we'll see what the future holds. But this is one way to address that. The other way, of course, is to do guidelines more efficiently. Guidelines can take as I mentioned, 12 to 18 months. We need to try to shorten that time frame. And there's probably a lot of ways we can do that by working together and collaborating and these sorts of things. So I just wanted to touch on that point because I think it was a burning question that's come up again. Yes, please.
Since you're saying that, I'm just wondering, would there be any provision for anticipatory guidelines? I mean, because if we are quick to do something, are we reading the trend? Can we anticipate something? You could see a train wreck coming sometimes. Right. So is there that kind of guidance?
So guidance to
into trends.
Guidance into trends. Yeah, so there's horizon scanning or evidence surveillance methods as well. And when we do at least our systematic reviews, we should identify not only current trials, we should also identify ongoing trials, and we can keep an eye on those for when their results are actually available, and that could be a trigger for an update as well. It's not only evidence, there might be legislation that is changing as well, and that could impact the recommendation. So a few years ago, Australia, for example, rolled out a national disability insurance scheme, and that changed a lot of what we do and how we fund support for people with disabilities. And that triggered a lot of changes in our recommendations as well. There might be, in the smoking cessation guideline, there were lots of changes to laws in Australia regarding vaping. And then we had to change the recommendations, not because of new evidence, but because actually the law was changing as well. So there's different triggers which could trigger an update as well. It's not just necessarily evidence. Good. Okay, good. And thank you for asking that question. Please, everyone, feel free to ask questions throughout the session. It's great to have these discussions as well. Okay, all right. So I thought I'd just show this article because I think it's a really nice summary about trustworthy guidelines versus untrustworthy guidelines. It's actually, you can see the senior author here is distinguished Professor Gordon Guy. And for those of you who are interested in the history of evidence-based medicine, he was actually the person who coined the term evidence-based medicine back in 1992. And he's still very active in guideline development, grade, and evidence-based medicine. But himself and some colleagues actually put out this article last year, I think it was, or relatively recently, about guidelines we can trust versus untrustworthy guidelines. And talked about the need to have clarity to consider your panel, which we've talked about as well, manage conflicts of interest, prioritise your outcomes and your selection of topics, needing systematic review evidence, considering values and preferences of patients, the public, or those with lived experience, making sure that you consider the trade-off between upsides and downsides, or benefits and harms in your recommendations, and making sure that you present the information in ways, basically present the information using absolute risks to help people actually interpret that information. So I won't go through every single one of these, but I thought this was a nice article which you might like to read at some stage. Okay, all right, so summing up this session, this is maybe my most important slide of the workshop. You'll probably see it again in the plenary. How do we ensure high quality, efficient development of trustworthy guidelines? Okay, so I'm going to list a number of resources and tools which you can use to inform your guideline development process. I could spend hours talking about every single one of these tools, but I think this is going to be a nice summary of modern guideline development. So first off, to plan and produce our guidelines, we can use the Guidelines International Network, GIM, McMaster checklist. And in this checklist, it goes through the 18 steps of guideline development, right from budgeting and planning your guidelines. So really all of those practical issues which are sometimes overlooked, through to forming recommendations, systematic views, including representative panels, all of this kind of thing. So for planning and production, we can use the GIM Master Checklist. For handbooks and methods guidance, we can use, well, in Australia, we use the National Health and Medical Research Council. For WHO guidelines, we use the WHO handbook, but we can also use a grade handbook. And very soon, I think you'll be able to substitute this with the ACE guidelines for guidelines. I've already mentioned the importance of reporting standards to make sure that our guidelines are transparent, and for that we can use the right statement. The right statement for clearly reporting our guideline development processes. To evaluate the trustworthiness of our own guideline as we develop it, we can use the Agreed To tool. We can also use the Agreed To tool to evaluate the trustworthiness of other guidelines that we may be considering to build upon or adopt or adapt in our setting. So we can use Agreed To. For efficient development, we can also use guideline development software and evidence synthesis software as well. And there is a lot of software nowadays, or support systems nowadays for evidence synthesis in particular. But for guideline development, we can use tools like MagicApp or GradePro, which really support rigorous and trustworthy guideline development, and also help publish and produce your guidelines as well. In terms of learning from one another and actually contributing to the science of guidelines and sharing experiences as well and challenges in guideline development, I can highly recommend the Guidelines International Network and joining the Guidelines International Network. And this is a way where you can actually find other guideline developers who are working on the same topic as you, and you can actually share your experiences, challenges, and you may be able to collaborate. So I can highly recommend joining GIM. To adopt and adapt guidelines, we can use a formal approach released by GRADE, which is Grade Adultment, and I'll be talking about this very soon. To engage with the community and stakeholders, we can use the resources from the News Consortium, which are looking at developing guidance for stakeholder involvement in systematic reviews and guidelines. And we can also use the GIM Public, the Guidelines International Network Public Working Group resource. They've actually published a handbook which gives a lot of good advice on this. And finally, for education and training, we can look at the InGuide program. This is a guideline credentialing program, and it actually has a number of different levels, from your guideline panel member, so all of your guideline panel could actually join that training to learn about the basics of trustworthy guidelines, through to your guideline chairs, guideline chair training program, which talks about how to be an efficient and high quality guideline chair, through to your guideline methodologists, so your people on the technical team who need to know all about the evidence synthesis and rigorous guideline development as well. So there's different levels that you can look at. So I think this is a nice summary of how people can actually go about developing trustworthy guidelines. like I said, we could talk about them all, for a very long time, but hopefully it will point you in the right direction. And as I mentioned, this is a genuine nicer checklist. Okay, very good. So that is the session on trustworthy guidelines, and I hope that will give you some good ideas about where to go as you develop your guidelines. So let's now move into how we can adopt or adapt the work of other guideline developers, and how we can also identify when we need to develop something from scratch, when we're not going to be able to actually adopt or adapt someone else's work. So firstly, let's just very quickly touch on some of the challenges that we face in guideline development internationally. So on average, a rigorous systematic review has been found to take 67.3 weeks to do a systematic review. That's a very, very long time. It's too long. It's too long, really. We also know that the average guideline takes anywhere between 18 to 30 months. Once again, this is far too long. This is a scenario where your guideline is going to be expired or out of date by the time it's published. In terms of how much a guideline costs, very roughly, these are very rough estimates, but in Australia, roughly it's about $1 million Australian dollars, which is, I guess it's about 1.15 or 1.2 Singapore dollars, depending on what the exchange rate is today. And obviously, it's a very, very costly process as well. And of course, it takes countless personnel. And what we know, in addition to all this, is that guideline development is incredibly inefficient. There's a lot of duplication in effort. There are a lot of guideline groups and technical teams across the globe all working on basically the same PICOs or same systematic reviews to inform their guidelines. And we're all looking at the same international evidence, but we're all creating our own systematic reviews. We also know there's a lack of use of software and automation tools in evidence synthesis and guideline development, which can help streamline the process as well. And then this big lack of collaboration and sharing. So I can't touch on all of the issues and solutions, but I wanted to talk about collaboration and sharing and then building upon the work of others. So one way to promote guideline collaboration is to have these registries of guidelines in development so that other guideline developers can actually identify who's doing what internationally, and then give you an opportunity to actually reach out to them and say, are you open to collaborate? Can we work together? Can we pool our resources together to do this more efficiently, reducing resources and hopefully doing it in a short time period as well. So the Guidelines International Network, we have a registry of guidelines in development where you can actually register your guideline just like you would register a trial or register a systematic review. You can register your guideline, and you can even say whether or not you are open to collaboration. You know, you're open to people actually coming and saying, hey, I'd like to work with you. We've also developed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding template that you can actually use when you have these different guideline bodies from across the globe collaborating together, just to make sure that you have common and shared expectations. Because obviously one of the biggest barriers to this collaboration is actually trust. Trust between the different guideline groups, and a formal memorandum can help with that. So that's one way to address this efficiency and cost crisis in guideline development. Now, another way is to adopt or adapt the work of others to your particular setting. So when you develop a guideline, I guess there's three ways you could do it. You could develop a de novo guideline or develop a guideline from scratch. You could do it all yourself. But if you're going to do this and do it in a trustworthy fashion, you need a lot of resources, a lot of expertise, and you need sometimes a lot of time. So if we don't have all of that time, or even if we just want to be more efficient with our resources, we can consider adopting the work of others. So we can actually identify trustworthy guidelines and then adopt them in our setting. However, as we've already talked about, when people make guidelines, we are making recommendations for our particular context or jurisdiction. So we are making it for a particular population. It's not like when we do a systematic review where we're looking at international evidence. For a guideline, we are making it for our particular area, our population, or our jurisdiction. So it needs to be applicable, and if we're using international evidence, we need to make sure we are contextualising it to our local setting as well. So in those cases, purely adopting a recommendation or a guideline from someone else doesn't really work. What we actually need to do is we need to adapt it and contextualise it to our particular setting. And there may be a number of reasons why a guideline from the United States or Australia or the UK or Canada or wherever it may be doesn't actually fit our setting. So in those cases, we would need to go down the adaptation path. Now, when we combine all of these terms together, what we have is development. This is a new term. It's a relatively recent term, which we've come up with in the GRADE working group, which basically provides the methods and the process for deciding if we should develop, de novo, adopt, or adapt guidelines. And we've published some work on this. Okay, so this is that's the original paper, and we actually just published an update. Now, if we are going to follow the GRADE development process, one of the key things we need is to make sure that the guidelines we are considering adopting or adapting actually have the major outputs that we need in guidelines. And this isn't always the case. This isn't always the case because not all guidelines internationally follow rigorous methods or use GRADE. So the major outputs in a guideline that uses GRADE is a summary of findings or a GRADE evidence profile. And this evidence profile is based on a systematic review of the evidence, and it contains assessments of the certainty in the results of the systematic review. And basically when we say certainty, we're talking about how much we can trust the results or how certain we are that the results reflect the truth, the real life scenario. So we do a systematic review and then we develop these evidence profiles or summary findings tables using the GRADE approach. I won't be going through all of the GRADE methods today. If you're interested, come talk to me. We'll talk for a long, long time over lunch about it. But anyway, so that's one output. Systematic reviews with evidence profiles. These GRADE evidence profiles feed into what's called GRADE evidence to decision tables, where we actually go through each of the criteria we need to consider when making a recommendation, and a panel will make their judgments about all of these important decision-making criteria. So we need this because if we're going to adopt or adapt the work of someone else, it needs to be very, very transparent what that panel considered in terms of the evidence and how that panel made their judgments. So that we can decide whether or not those judgments are applicable to our setting. So we need these evidence to decision tables, which make it very, very transparent how people went, literally from the evidence of a systematic review results to your recommendation. If we don't have that, myself at least, I don't think it's very good to actually then adopt or adapt someone else's work because it's not transparent. It's like we don't know what they did. And then finally, of course, we need that recommendation because at the end of the day, that's actually what we're going to then adopt or adapt. Okay, this is just what they look like. So how does this actually work? So first off, we have this summary of findings table, we have this evidence to decision table, and then we have the recommendation. And then we need to check if we agree with that. We need to check if it is actually up to date, and if we need to make any changes. Now, if we do look at that, and we realise that, well, in Singapore or in our setting, we would make different judgments, or we would interpret that evidence differently, or we have different population demographics, a different culture, a different health system, different funding measures, all of these sorts of things means that we need to actually adapt a recommendation. And that's where we would then go down the adaptation path. And of course, if we can't find any good systematic reviews or good recommendations, then we need to develop from scratch. And this is how we do adultment in action. Okay, so this is all about contextualising the evidence, and increasingly we're seeing this term contextualisation used in guideline development and acknowledging the importance of contextualisation. And there's no implementation without contextualisation, is what we sometimes say. We need to make sure we are contextualising the evidence and making sure that all of the judgments are relevant to our own context. So incredibly important. So there's a flow chart outlining the whole grade adultment approach, from selecting your guideline topic, prioritising your questions, to then identifying appropriate source guidelines. And just to note, this may not just be one guideline, it may actually be a number of guidelines, because what we're actually doing is we're not saying we're going to develop a guideline in type 2 diabetes. We develop a list of PICO questions that we're going to want to address in our guideline, and then we can look at different guidelines from around the globe to see if they've used rigorous methods, see if they've addressed it, prioritised PICOs we've put forward, and then we can pull information from these different guidelines if, of course, they're rigorous and trustworthy. So this is just a flowchart of a whole process for grade adultment. Now, very, very recently, we released updated grade guidance for adultment based on a number of real-world examples. So we've been doing this now for a reasonable amount of time, and we've learned the most efficient processes for how to do this, and also how to overcome some of the challenges that we've faced. And as I mentioned, very, very recently, we put out this formal guidance on grade adultment. So if this is something you're interested in, you can look at this guidance here. Okay, I've got a lot of slides on how we can do this, but all of this is included in this paper. So I'm just going to run through a lot of these. Firstly, I'll just touch on some of these which I think are perhaps more important. So when we identify, when we do our search for guidelines that we can adopt or adapt, different groups have used different criteria for what they consider good enough, let's say, good enough or trustworthy enough for us to then adopt or adapt. And you can see here that some people have used whether or not it's relevant, of course, to your PICO, to your questions. That's a key criteria. Whether it is credible, and people judge credibility in different ways. Commonly, it's used by applying the Agreed To tool. And for those of you who are familiar with Agreed To, this is a tool which you can use to appraise the quality of guidelines. And many people are particularly focused on one of the Agreed To domains, which is called the rigor of development. And in this rigor of development domain, they're talking about whether or not there was comprehensive searches and risk and bias assessment, and basically well-done systematic reviews and methods to develop that guideline. And they put this cutoff of perhaps 60%. This is what some groups have done to determine the credibility. They also consider recency and up-to-dateness, so whether or not that is a recent and up-to-date guideline as well. And obviously, we want to adopt or adapt guidelines that are recent or up-to-date. For me, when we've been considering this, we also consider whether or not they use the grade approach, of course, because we need to use grade in our guidelines development in Australia, and whether or not they have very clear evidence profiles, grade evidence profiles, evidence to decision tables that we can adapt or adopt so it's transparent, and of course, clearly stated actionable recommendations. So there's some of the criteria that you can consider when you're going to adopt or adapt a guideline. And these are important because a lot of guidelines that you may come across internationally are not very well conducted. On average, in terms of that rigor of development scale that I just mentioned, from the Agreed To, a gross average is that most guidelines are about 50% in terms of their rigor of development. So there's a lot of issues with guidelines internationally. So we need to check that they're actually suitable for adoption or adaptation. Okay, all right. Then we will match the recommendations to each of the prioritised question. If they match, then we can consider whether or not we need to update the evidence synthesis, the systematic reviews that are underpinning these as well. We could, if they're out of date, we could hopefully get access to those systematic reviews and just update them rather than doing those systematic reviews from scratch. Once again, we need to make sure that they're high quality systematic reviews, so using modern methods, comprehensive searching, reported transparently using Prisma, use risk of bias tools, did a grade assessment, synthesise data using peer analysis, possible, all of these sorts of things that we know about. Okay, then we check to see if that evidence and decision framework is available. Sometimes a guideline may have considered some of the criteria in an evidence and decision framework, but haven't actually explicitly provided a table. Sometimes in these cases we can try to develop our own, but it can be a little bit difficult. So we may need to develop our own evidence decision framework and obviously contextualise that, assess the evidence and decision judgments, develop the recommendations, look at the adopted recommendations, consider if there need to be adapted recommendations or if we need to development. So I'll rush through some of these steps, but if you're interested, like I said, we do have those resources available. Now, when we do an development process, we should also be very, very transparent in how we have done this. So there is actually an extension to the right statement for transparently reporting guidelines, which is called the Right Adapt checklist. So just like we have Prisma extensions or Strobe extensions or Consort extensions for different types of clinical trials or systematic reviews, there is this Right Adapt checklist which we should use. So we are also being very, very transparent in the decisions and approaches that we took to adopt or adapt a guideline. Right. So that is how we can build on the work of others and adopt or adapt other people's work to make our guidelines more efficient while still being trustworthy. Okay, so let's just reflect quickly on guideline panels and the nature of guideline panels. And I am, it's a real privilege in my career because I'm lucky enough to work with a lot of guideline developers, a lot of different panels, largely in Australia, but also in some cases internationally. And I think it's a real privilege because most people on guideline panels are there because they are incredibly passionate about a topic. They want to improve health outcomes. They're driven by improving health outcomes. They're very, very knowledgeable. In some cases, it's even their life's work that we are making recommendations about. So it is a real privilege to work with these people. And in most cases, people are doing it out of hours or for no costs or reimbursement as well, basically volunteering their time and efforts just to improve health outcomes. So it's an absolute privilege to work with these guideline panels. But as you can expect, when you have a room full of very passionate, very knowledgeable people, often coming from different perspectives, you can actually find it a pretty difficult process to actually craft a recommendation. And for some of you who have been on guideline panels, some of these sorts of statements may be familiar to you, where people do really just disagree because they are very strongly passionate about the topic. Some people think that changing practice or changing recommendations can be just too hard, and there's sometimes a push to just keep things how it's always been. Some people get very fixated on that one new study, that shiny new study and results, and want to focus just on that rather than all of the evidence, the entire body of evidence as well. And if you're not careful, if your chair hasn't been trained up, you can actually go around in circles to where it gets to a really difficult circle of discussions, and it's hard to actually come up with your final recommendation. And sometimes it's just a battle of attrition in that finally just someone will say something and everyone's had enough discussing it and it will be agreed to, which is not a great approach. So it can be a little bit like herding cats sometimes. So how do we make this a more, streamlined, transparent and systematic approach to actually making our recommendations? Well, what we've developed within GRADE is an evidence to decision framework which explicitly states all of the different considerations a panel should think about before making a recommendation. Not only that, it makes you walk through and make judgments about each of those. So anyone who picks up the guideline will be able to see what the panel's views were on the benefits of that particular recommendation, or the feasibility of that recommendation, or the acceptability of that recommendation. So it really helps structure discussion and move through that process once again from evidence to recommendation. For the panels that I've been involved with where we have introduced using this evidence to decision framework, they have mentioned that this has made the whole process a lot simpler and more straightforward and structured, because you really make sure you are giving everything its due time and discussing every single point as a panel. Okay. So when we actually do this, obviously making recommendations can be tricky because we need to weigh up the benefits and the importance of the topic with the costs and whether it's actually feasible and acceptable as well, and weigh this up with the harms and potential costs as well. So it's important to make sure we are considering all of the elements that will influence a decision, not just the benefits of a particular intervention. So within GRADE, these are the decision-making criteria. These are the things that we should all consider as a panel and actually make explicit judgments about when we are making our recommendation. The balance between benefits, harms and burdens. And we need to remember that there is always some sort of undesirable effect or harm associated with any intervention, any recommendation. Even if it is just the simple burden of having to remember to take a pill once a day, that is still some form of treatment burden or undesirable effect. So there is always some sort of harm or burden. And my colleague, Professor Holger Schumann, likes to say that it shouldn't be do no harm, it should be do no net harm. Because we're always doing some harm, but we're normally doing more good by doing that as well. So we need to consider the balance between benefits, harms and burdens, patients' values and preferences. When we're taking a population perspective, we also need to consider whether or not we will be improving health equity across a population. And of course we need to consider resource use, feasibility and acceptability as well. And all of this is balanced by what we call the certainty of the evidence. So within GRADE, we've actually developed this template, and for those of you who are embarking on making recommendations in your guideline, I can strongly recommend actually using this template and actually going through it with your panel and making sure that people are making their judgments. So you can see here, let me skip my mouse. So you can see here that we have all of the important decision-making criteria in this column, and the judgment of the panel. Oh, sorry, I can't work it all out together. But you can see that in that column there is the judgment that the panel has to make, and then you have to agree to it. And this can often be done using a formal vote. In the central column, you have the research evidence which is informing those judgments that the panel have considered in making that explicit judgment. And then you also have space for additional considerations, things that might come up in a panel discussion or other forms of information which might help the panel make a judgment. So the first judgment is whether or not the problem is a priority. Then we need to start to talk about the desirable effects, and you need to actually stipulate whether the desirable effects are large, trivial, small, moderate or large. And then you need to consider the undesirable effects as well, and whether they are large, moderate, small or trivial as well. We of course consider the certainty of the evidence, so this is done using the GRADE approach and assessing the certainty of evidence as high, moderate, low or very low. And then you need to consider patients' preferences and values as well, and whether or not they would value a particular health state more highly than another, or value one outcome more highly than another, because that, if there is a benefit and a harm present from that intervention, obviously we want to see how the patients or those with lived experience actually value these different outcome states. Then we need to consider the balance of effects, and does it actually favour the intervention or the thing that we're comparing it to. We need to consider acceptability to key stakeholders, and those key stakeholders might be clinicians, it could also be policymakers or administrators, and of course it can be those with lived experience and patients and the public. We also need to consider if it's actually going to be feasible. Do we have the right training structures in place? Do we have the equipment in place? All of these types of things as well. And then what we get is actually get this summary of judgments that the panel have made, which is a nice summary which we can then use to help us inform our recommendation. So we can see all of the judgments that the panel have made and whether or not we should be making a recommendation for or against a particular intervention, and with what strength we should be making that as well. The great thing about this is that if you do this, then the end readers, the end users of your guidelines are going to be able to see really, really clearly how you came to your recommendation. And it's very, very transparent. And people in different contexts can also see that. And then they can also look at your judgments and say, well, actually, here in Singapore, this wouldn't be feasible for whatever reason, or it wouldn't be acceptable to the population for whatever reason. And then you can actually adapt those judgments. Now, the good thing is this framework is actually embedded in the Grade Pro software. So if anyone, if you haven't used this software before, it does make this process a lot simpler as well. And we can do it all electronically. You can see here in this evidence section for desirable effects, essentially what we see is that grade evidence profile that I mentioned earlier. So the panel will discuss that and then make their judgments. They can also add these additional considerations. Of course, when the panel are making their judgments, we should make sure we are balancing or considering conflicts of interest as well. Okay, now there was some questions about costs and how we should be considering costs when we make our recommendations. Well, the first thing that we need to consider is what perspective or what type of recommendation are we actually making? So what is our guideline actually focusing on? And we've developed different evidence and decision frameworks depending on the type of recommendation that you are actually making. So sometimes guidelines are targeted at a clinician an individual clinician working with an individual patient in front of them. And if you're taking that perspective, when you're thinking about costs, for example, the main costs that you might be thinking about are the actual out-of-pocket costs for that individual patient when you're thinking about costs. Other times we might be thinking about clinicians working across a population, and then we start to think about costs across a population as well and the impact of resources across a population. Sometimes these frameworks are used for coverage decisions, and of course here we start to get that the blurred line between guideline element and health technology assessment. And then other times we may be making a recommendation related to health systems or public health as well, so across a population. And then of course the other consideration we need to have is when we are considering costs, what perspective are we taking? Are we taking an individual perspective, a health system perspective, or even the broader societal perspective regarding costs? And this is obviously linked to traditional thinking in economic evaluations. When we are considering this, considering how we consider costs in our recommendations, we also need to consider our team as well, and what resources we have, and do we actually have the ability to do formal economic evaluations as part of our guideline development? Do we have health economists on board, and is how much time and resources do we actually have in terms of considering these sorts of things? So also very important considerations. So as I mentioned, depending on what type of recommendation you are actually making, you may have different decision-making criteria in your evidence and decision framework. For example, I mentioned equity earlier. If you are taking an individual clinician working with an individual patient perspective, equity probably isn't an issue which should be informing the direction or strength of a recommendation. However, if you're taking a population level perspective, then you really should be considering health equity and health disparities across the population. And the same goes for costs. And this has been outlined in more detail in this paper here. Apologies, it's slightly cut off here. But you can see that our considerations of resource use will be different depending on the type of recommendation and, of course, the perspective that we're taking. Once again, that individual clinician type individual patient would largely often be about out-of-pocket costs for that individual patient. Okay. All right, so what does the whole process look like? You can see here, this is the evidence and decision framework for health systems and public health decisions. And I think it's a nice infographic which really shows the whole process here. Basically, you come up with your key questions, your guideline scope and your PICOs by having representative panels who prioritise the questions and the outcomes that you're going to address. You have the technical team who then do the systematic reviews and evidence reviews to inform each of these criteria. And in this case, because it is for health systems and public health decisions, you may also have health economists as part of that team. You then need to consider all of these different criteria that we've mentioned, and then the research evidence for each of these criteria, and then you need to make these actual judgments. So the panel are still making these judgments, and they should be transparently made. And then, of course, this will finally lead to our recommendation, which we then want to get into practice. Right, so in terms of, once again, just going into a little bit more detail in terms of considering costs in your evidence decision process, you may not have the resources to do a full economic evaluation, or there may not be any full economic evaluations available for you in your setting to then consider in your guideline. So when there is no cost effectiveness evidence available or no formal economic evaluations, there has been a pragmatic approach used, which is called the cost of preventing an event. And this is a really back of the envelope or back of the napkin type calculation to determine how much it costs to prevent a single event or single outcome. It's very, very easy to calculate. It's essentially the cost of the intervention times by the number needed to treat. And this can give us a very, very rough estimate on costs. Now, of course, there are a lot of limitations of this. So it's not necessarily recommended, but it has been used as a pragmatic solution to actually at least consider costs. Now, of course, in the scenarios where published cost effectiveness analyses are available, then we should be using these when we are making those recommendations across the health system, and particularly for coverage decisions, and also granting uncertainty in those. And this is the most recent, a couple of papers which discuss resource use in guideline development, which you might want to look at. So when we are considering these questions, we consider how large are the resource requirements, what is the certainty of evidence of these resource requirements, and are the net benefits worth the incremental cost as well in our recommendations. Okay, so Those are the criteria that we use using the GRADE approach to move from the evidence to making a recommendation. We do it in this structured way using these formal evidence decision tables, and of course we consider costs where appropriate when doing this. Now, does anyone have any questions or reflections on the evidence decision criteria, how we identify evidence for each of these criteria or consider evidence, or how we actually make judgments? Any questions, reflections, or thoughts from anyone? Okay, what we might do, just like we have throughout the day, we might spend 5 to 10 minutes now, and what I would like you all to do is discuss how you have previously considered these criteria when making your recommendations. If there are parts of it that you perhaps don't consider or don't give as much weight to, and what you might like to do in the future. So now's a good chance to share your experiences working across your guideline panels about how you have or have not considered these criteria and what you might like to do in the future. So I'll give you about 7 minutes to discuss this. So wonderful discussions, really, really good discussions. Thank you for and sharing all of those points. Okay, so let's talk about implementation now. So guidelines do not implement themselves, and there is not a lot of point in doing the best, most trustworthy guideline you can do if it is never actually taken up in practice. So we need to be considering implementation in our guideline efforts. There's no point doing all this work if the end users never actually use it. So implementation is really critical and really important when we are thinking about guideline development. It's often a different group of people who actually do the implementation efforts and not necessarily the guideline panel. So sometimes the guideline panel have to really consider how we can make our guideline more implementable, so it's easier to implement as well. So often we talk about implementability when we talk about guidelines. Now we are short of time, so I'm just going to probably skip through a few of these slides to get to the real important information regarding implementation from a guideline perspective. And hopefully we'll be able to share these slides. One thing I'll say about implementation is it's not straightforward. It is quite complex. It can be messy, and we know that health systems are very complex systems, and sometimes health system outputs don't always react predictably to inputs, and it can be messy and non-linear as well. And so what we sometimes use when thinking about implementation is what we call evidence implementation theories, models, or frameworks. And this can help us plan for and consider important implementation-related aspects to our guideline. And in fact, this is almost always done. The most common theory is the Isla-Giat principle. Maybe some of you have heard of this before. Basically, it stands for, it seems like a good idea at the time. So most people, when they're doing implementation, come up with some idea and say, hey, we should do this. We should perhaps do this particular education session or something like that to try to implement this guideline, because it seems like a good idea. So we're always using some sort of ad hoc theory or common sense. But there are actually a lot of more evidence-based theories which have come from sort of backgrounds such as behavioural sciences, looking at change management, complexity science as well, which we could probably use, which are a little bit more formal and probably going to be a bit more useful than the Isla-Giat principle. Now, we could spend weeks talking about all of these different theories, models and frameworks for evidence implementation, because there are a lot. But there are ways that you can select what is the best theory, model, or framework for you. And there are some nice summaries of these different implementation theories, models, and frameworks. Okay, a tool which can actually help you select a implementation science theory, model, or framework for your guideline methods is called the TCAST tool as well. And here is a paper that reports on that tool.
So we don't have time to go through all of the different theories, models and frameworks, but what I want to show here is a quote from, I guess, one of the world-leading experts in implementation science who I've been lucky enough to work with on a number of initiatives, Professor Jeremy Grimshaw. And basically what he sums up very, very simply, of course it's always more complex than this, but what he has summed up in this quote is that most of these theories, models and frameworks suggest that knowledge translation or implementation is more likely to be successful if there is an assessment of the likely barriers and facilitators, and that this informs the choice of a knowledge translation strategy. So one thing that we can do as guideline developers or as people who are wanting to implement the guidelines is consider the barriers and facilitators to that translation of evidence into practice, and then try to link those barriers and come up with strategies that can actually address those barriers. Okay, now there are also very useful resources regarding that we can actually look to, which comprehensively list all of the, a lot of the barriers that we could encounter when implementing evidence. And there's also a resource which is called ERIC, which has a compilation of dozens and dozens and dozens of implementation strategies. And this is a little bit dense, I know, but if you're interested in this space, what's really interesting, I think, is if we combine the use of what's called CIFA, which is the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. That can help us identify barriers using that framework. And then if we match it with ERIC, which is the compilation of strategies, we can see what strategies we could potentially consider for the barriers, rather than just trying to think off the top of our head. This can be a really useful tool. Okay, all right. Let's talk about implementation in guidelines now, more about what we should be considering as a guideline panel. So when we talk about implementation in guidelines, we can consider a few different interrelated concepts. So we have implementability. Implementability is about how we can make our guidelines easier or more easier to be implemented. So we're making the job of implementation science easier. Related to this, of course, is dissemination as well. So we need to consider what our knowledge translation strategy or knowledge dissemination strategy is going to be in terms of the formats and outputs of our guideline. Of course, there's implementation, which we've just discussed as well. And then there's also impact, right? And we want to also assess the impact of our guideline. And there's different ways that we can assess the impact of our guideline to see if it was worth all of that effort. So let's start off with implementable guidelines. How do we make implementable guidelines? Well, firstly, we need to have recommendations which are actionable. So they actually have an action that people can follow. They're not long, convoluted sentences which are unclear and you read it and then you still don't actually know what to do in practice. They should contain an action that can be followed. We should develop appropriate and tailored formats for different audiences. So, as someone mentioned a little bit earlier, sometimes a guideline can be 300 pages long in a PDF on a website somewhere. Now that's not very digestible and probably not very useful at the point of care. So we can develop clinician summaries. We can also develop decision support tools. Increasingly there are efforts to look at translating recommendations straight into clinical decision support systems. And there's a lot of efforts to do this. And we can also create plain language summaries and patient versions of our guidelines as well, for actually the patient or for public. Guidelines will be more implementable if we include consultation along the process, so we are getting a lot of feedback about things, as we've already talked about the feasibility and acceptability, and considering that in our guideline and our recommendations. So broader consultation will help improve the implementability of our guidelines. So considering our end users, so who are the actual end users and what do they want in terms of the guideline? And then stakeholder involvement as well, which we've discussed a lot. And one way to help with guidelines being implemented is if you can actually get different groups, perhaps different professional societies or advocacy groups, who actually endorse the recommendation. You actually put it out to them and say, the Cancer Council of Australia, for example, will you endorse this? The Royal College or something or other, will you endorse this? And then that's a good way to help as well. Having more trustworthy guidelines help with that implementability as well. People are more likely to follow guidelines which they deem as credible and trustworthy if it's applicable and feasible and if the message is clear. There are a couple of tools we can use to actually assess the implementability. We have the GLEAR, the Guideline Implementability Appraisal tool, and this can be a useful tool to use on your own guidelines to see if it's actually implementable or not, and also the tool called the Guide. Okay, just quickly on implementable recommendations. So to create implementable or actionable recommendations, we can do our best to follow the points here on this screen. So for a recommendation to be actionable, it should be clear who should do it, what it is that they should be doing, when, and actually when not, and for whom. That's one way to make recommendations actionable. We should do our best to try to avoid hedging and equivocal language. Sometimes guideline developers love using equivocal language, perhaps because the certainty of evidence is low, so we're trying to hedge our bets, so to speak. One term that people like to use is consider, and some people like to use this term consider, but what does consider actually mean? You have a little think about it and then you might have. So try to avoid these types of terms if possible. Create these recommendations for different audiences, and you can stipulate what the actual who the actual end user should be. Shared decision making. I think this was mentioned earlier. So you can translate guideline recommendations in some cases into shared decision making tools, and we know that when we are making conditional or weak recommendations, particularly, the choice of treatment or choice of strategy will be very much dependent on the individual patient's own preferences and values. And you can work that out through using decision aids, shared decision making tools. Using just as a side note, using software like Grade Pro and Magic App automatically, in some cases, can automatically create decision aids for you based on your recommendations and evidence. And of course, they should reflect the strength of the recommendation as well. So you should clearly say whether or not this is a strong or conditional recommendation. All right. Okay, so how do we do dissemination? We know there's no silver bullet or golden strategy for how we should disseminate our guidelines. So what most people do is sort of this multi-pronged approach. They do lots of different types of dissemination efforts, and I've mentioned some of those already. We're running a little bit out of time, so I don't think we're going to be able to go into how all of you do your dissemination efforts. But I wanted to show you a couple of slides, dense slides, but these are from a guideline protocol which we've recently written about our plan methods for guideline development. So we're going to do an official launch of the guideline. We're going to circulate the guideline to all of our steering groups and advisor groups involved, and also request them to circulate it widely through their networks. We're going to circulate the guideline to professional associations and societies, promote the guideline through the networks and memberships of our partners, and obviously make sure we have some partners. Disseminate it through newsletters, social media, email lists, etc. We're going to publish a guideline in a peer-reviewed journal, present it at national and international conferences, provide it to state-based government and non-government agencies, Australian universities who are teaching health sciences will also distribute to them to hopefully use in their educational materials and training materials as well. Create online training modules, create different formats as well, and I'll touch on that on the next slide. And also provide a link, a dedicated home for the guideline, which includes educational and online materials. And in terms of companion documents and educational resources, we are planning to create all of these things. A summary statement of the actual recommendations, clinician templates and case examples, a 2-page summary, a lived experience companion guide, implementation resources, webinars, etc., etc., etc. We'll consider. So this is obviously incredibly comprehensive, and this is a guideline which has a lot of funding. Not all of this is always possible, so you'll need to consider what's going to be the best bang for your buck in terms of dissemination impacts. Okay, so how do we actually assess impact now of our guideline? Because we want to know that all this work has actually done some good or had some sort of impact. And we can look at impact in a few different ways. We can look at impact in terms of simple awareness and knowledge of a guideline. And this can be informed by things like website hits, social media mentions, inquiries that may come into centralised emails, and also perhaps through some surveys to see if there is awareness across a profession without a guideline. We can actually use what's called a clinical guideline determinants questionnaire to do this more formally. We can also do mixed method studies to see what people's perceptions and attitudes are towards a guideline. And then in terms of or real life impact on outcomes, we can use this framework for implementation outcomes from Proctor et al., which looks at all of these different types of outcomes that we could consider when we are thinking about the impact of our guideline. Okay. All right, so we've actually had some really good discussions already today about the importance of including really any representatives from any group who are going to be impacted by your recommendation. And it's not always easy to do, but it is always important. And we should strive our best to include patients or the public or those with lived experience. We should strive our best to include all health professionals and make sure that our guideline group is multidisciplinary as well. And also think about policymakers and administrators and the roles that they may have in that guideline as well. And there can be these different levels of engagement. So obviously you can't have every single person on our guideline panel, or else your actual panel is going to become too unwieldy. So we need to think about different avenues to provide feedback as well. And you might actually form advisory groups for these different types of stakeholders who can then feed into the panel, potentially through their representatives on the panel, to make sure that all of the different issues are considered. Okay. So once again, you can see this is a visual representation of our GIN master checklist, and you can see here, obviously, when we are coming up with our guideline team, we need to make sure that it is multidisciplinary. Sometimes in research, more generally, we talk about the 10 Ps, and these are the different types of stakeholders who we could include to varying extents as part of the guideline process. And so I just want to stress, when I say we can include all of these people as part of the guideline process, once again, I don't necessarily mean having every single one of these people on the panel, or representatives of every single group on the panel. But what we can actually do is we can plan out at what stages of the guideline we need to engage with different or various groups. So just quickly, the GIN Public Toolkit is very good, provides a lot of good resources on this. So for example, I think I mentioned the GIN Master Checklist has 18 steps. And then we can consider for each of our stakeholders or end users how they should be involved in each of those 18 steps in the guideline development process. And you can actually create basically a table or this cross-tabulation of who's going to be included when and what sort of engagement we're looking for. Are we just looking for some feedback or advice, or are we actually looking for them to be part of the decision making, as in voting as well? And this is an example of looking at policymakers' level of engagements throughout the guideline process. So at the start, they might be involved in the organisation of budget and planning, they might be involved in the decision making. Other steps, they might just be involved in providing advice and feedback, and in other steps, they might just be involved by getting reports of progress. Okay. So like I mentioned, having just one panel sometimes doesn't necessarily work, or just having a panel. You might want to consider having other groups involved in your guideline governance. And so here's just an example of a guideline that we've been in, where we have the guideline development panel, and the panel of those who are actually going to be voting on the recommendation and the decision-making criteria. But of course, alongside that, we also have the evidence and technical team who are going to be doing all of the evidence reviews, have perhaps initial drafts of the evidence decision framework. But we also have these advisory groups. So we have a clinician and content advisory group, we have a lived experience advisory group, and then a research and policy advisory group as well. And they feed in to the panel and provide feedback along the way. Not all guidelines that I've been involved with, but some have actually had an implementation team as well. And they actually form that implementation team right from the start, so that they're planning implementability and implementation throughout the whole process, so it's not just this afterthought at the end. Also thinking about partner, member and supporter committees and having representatives from groups or bodies who you want to endorse your guidelines, and then a project steering group to oversee it all. And what's really useful is to have an independent conflict of interest oversight committee as well, to independently assess all of the conflicts of interest of everyone involved in the guideline. And that's what I'm going to get into next. But I might just pause, because we've caught up a little bit of time. I might just pause. Does anyone have any questions from any of that so far? Okay, all right. Conflicts of interest. We've talked about this already. Conflicts of interest are incredibly important in all health research, but particularly in guideline development. And we need to make sure that we are managing conflicts appropriately. If we aren't managing conflicts appropriately, this is really going to hurt the credibility and the trustworthiness of our guideline. Now, I'll just say straight away, having a conflict is not a bad thing. It is not a bad thing to have a conflict of interest when it comes to a guideline. And the fact that you may have worked with industry, or you may have developed some sort of intervention or tool or something like that, that is not a bad thing. In fact, that probably shows that you're a leader in the field, or you've made a really important contribution to your discipline or specialty or whatever it may be. But it probably does mean that you are somewhat influenced by that experience, or by that role, or by that funding. That will probably mean that when it comes to making a recommendation or a judgment, that experience or previous work will influence your decision in a particular way, which will result in some sort of bias. So it's not a bad thing. Sometimes people talk about conflicts of interest like it's a really bad thing. It's not a bad thing to have a conflict of interest, but it is a bad thing when people who have conflicts of interest are part of the decision making on a guideline panel. And I'll say that. Sometimes conflicts of interest, people with conflicts of interest can still provide a really useful contribution as well to a guideline, but they probably shouldn't be involved in the actual decision-making process, that voting process at the end of the day. So I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, so this is a nice framework here from Adiako and his team, who have basically provided this framework for categorising and assessing conflicts of interest. So you can have either individual interests, or you can have interests which are related to your institution. And from an individual perspective, you may have financial, intellectual, or personal interests. So it's not always necessarily about financial interests. You may also have intellectual interests as well. So if I developed a particular scale, for example, to measure something, to assess an outcome, then I'm going to have an intellectual interest in seeing that being recommended and used and spread far and wide. And that's an intellectual interest. So we need to consider these as well. If I have a personal belief in, something like the keto diet or something like that, a very strong personal belief in that, then I may be swayed in a recommendation regarding nutrition advice because of those personal beliefs or very strong personal views as well. So it's not always about finances. Now, there may be, finances may be a direct financial benefit or a benefit through advancing your professional status as well, which we need to consider. And from our institutional affiliation, there may be a financial benefit to the institution, or it may be a non-financial conflict as well. Okay, all right. So what does the actual process look like? Well, first of all, everyone needs to disclose their conflicts of interest. And once again, having a conflict is not a bad thing. We should be comfortable to disclose all of our conflicts. There can sometimes then be a process of verifying those conflicts of interest, and then we actually need to assess the risk of that conflict of interest. And different groups do this in different ways. Sometimes these are categorised as high risk, low risk, or no risk. And there are different rules that different guideline panels or groups may have. For example, someone with high risk may not be allowed to be a part of the guideline at all. So they're completely not allowed to be part of it. And in other cases, someone with a low risk, for example, may be able to be a part of the guideline, the panel or advisory groups, but when it comes to the intervention of the recommendation where their conflict exists, they may be excluded from either the discussion or the voting, so decision making. So there's different processes. These are called the management processes of the conflict of interest. Okay, so there are, as always, there are good standards that we can follow in terms of conflict of interest management. Just recently, there's been this paper. This is more about managing the conflicts of interest. When we manage the conflicts of interest, we need to also consider: can we actually eliminate the risk? Can we remove the conflict? Because that would be one strategy. We could actually remove that conflict. We also then consider: would that actually produce a consistent direction of bias if the conflict remains? We also need to consider whether excluding that person will really impede the guidelines. So sometimes, if it's a really niche area, a really specific topic, excluding someone with a lot of expertise could actually harm the process. So then you really need to think about how we're going to manage that. And once again, that might be the case where they can take part, they might present to the panel, they might take part in some discussion, but they're actually being excluded from the decision making. So we use the NHMRC, largely we use the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia conflict of interest management policy, but of course you'll probably develop your own for how to do this. And as always, we should be reporting this as well, and there's a right statement extension about how we should manage and report conflicts of interest in guidelines. Okay, all right. Very, very quickly, if we are going to include people from the public or those with lived experience, we need to make sure we are valuing their input. And normally, from my experience, clinicians are happy enough to volunteer their time as part of guideline panels and advisory groups. In some cases, there may need to be payment either to the clinicians or their institution, but most of the time, in my case at least, health professionals will volunteer their time. But I think this is a lot to ask from members of the public or for consumers. So we need to value their input, and we should also ask them, what would they like? Would they like perhaps authorship or to be acknowledged in any papers or reports that come out. But also, we should probably compensate for their time as well. And in Australia, we pay people with lived experience, patients of the public, around $60 an hour to take part in our guidelines. People pay different things, but that's what we do in ours. Okay, and just touching on the chair now, it's really important for the chair to be independent because the chair is going to manage all of the discussions, the voting process, and the guideline, the whole guideline. So it's really, really important that the chair, of course everyone, but the chair should have no conflict of interest. This is why some groups, when it comes to guidelines, they actually have a completely independent chair, so a non-expert chair. So someone who's perhaps still obviously respected and knowledgeable and has these sort of soft skills, let's say, about managing people and decision-making processes, but they may not be necessarily an expert in the topic of that guideline. And this is a way to obviously manage conflicts of interest. So it might be something that you'll consider. And being a chair, it can be a tricky thing. So you want to make sure that if you are looking for a chair, or if you're a chair yourself, you actually do set aside enough time to do it properly, because it is a big effort. And then in terms of actual group processes, in terms of voting and consensus, because this was an issue, I really don't like the term consensus-based statements or consensus recommendations, because all recommendations in a panel should be by consensus, right? You should always be discussing it as a group and then approving it as a group, as a panel, so there should be some sort of consensus. So that's, I'd like to see this term consensus recommendation removed. And this can happen whether it's high, moderate, low, or very low evidence. We still need to consider what evidence is available. Even if there's no empirical evidence available, then we may need to use other approaches, such as what we call the evidence from experts approach, where we do surveys of experts and their experiences in terms of how many times they might have treated someone with this condition and seen this outcome as a way to collect some sort of evidence. So I'm not a fan of this consensus-based recommendation versus evidence-based recommendation. I think we should always be striving to make formal recommendations, and these formal recommendations always have some level of consensus. Now, what that level of consensus may be, sometimes people go with a simple majority, sometimes people say 80% of people need to say yes to approve something. Sometimes people even have stronger cut-offs or consensus for, say, a strong recommendation as compared to a conditional recommendation. So these are just some considerations for you. Everyone does this a little bit differently, and I don't think there are any golden rules about how it should be done. Some people use pre-voting, or pre-polling, and then have some discussion in the meeting and then vote again. Some people just vote in the panel meetings. Some people have lots and lots of meetings on their panel. Some people have just one very, very long panel meeting over 2 or 3 days. There's lots of different ways that people do this. There's no necessarily right or wrong way. Okay, right. Final tips from me. After all of this, what I think is really, really useful is to actually create a protocol for your guideline. That actually, when you're planning your guideline, you actually create a protocol and you say, how are you going to do all these things? How are you going to recruit people to your panel? How are you going to manage conflicts of interest? How are you going to search for the evidence? How are you going to consider all of the decision-making criteria? How are you going to vote? What do you mean by consensus? All of these sorts of things. I think it's really useful to create a protocol for your guideline. And the last thing I'll say is invest in implementation. We need to make sure we are supporting implementation, or all this wonderful work we're doing in guidelines is not actually going to have any impact. And I gave an example yesterday where I've been a part of a public health guideline in Australia looking at physical activity and sleep, or the 24-hour movement cycle. And it cost, I won't give the exact figure, but it cost around $700,000 to create this guideline. But we are now seeking funding up to about $6 million to support this implementation. because we actually want it to have some impact in practice. So we need to invest in implementation as well, not just creating the best, most shiny guidelines. Now that's a public health example, and there's a lot of big costs because there's mass media campaigns and other things, but it just goes to show we need investment in implementation. All right, so I will leave it there, but I believe we have a bit of time for some questions, perhaps suggestions, and we will also, if there is no questions from the floor, we'll return to the burning questions and see if we answer them all. But that is the end of the formal presentation, so thank you for that.